All right, ladies and gentlemen. So Matt, and we got one situation with Crowdcast. It's not linking yet, so I'm just waiting for something to go properly live with everybody that sign up in Crowdcast. This is so we'll have to. It's kind of restart, but people are watching us live right now on Facebook, on Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I don't know why. Usually this never happens, but let's see. So what I'm gonna do is, in the meantime, let me do I'm gonna put us out of the camera until everything is set. 1 second, okay, guys?
Okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, good day. My name is Federico Hernandez. I'm sorry for that. We just had a small hiccup right now in the intro, technical problems, but everything was solved pretty quickly. Thank you for everyone for joining us today on the WIRSPA channel today with Matt Patrick, who's your host, and he has a special guest, which is Patrick Mayers. Who will he introduce yourself? Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's good to be back here with you, Fetty, and it's great to be doing our Icon series, doing another episode of our Icon series. For those of you who are watching for the first time, the Icon series is a WIRSPA ACR Zavi production where we are interviewing some of the most the people who have been around in the rum industry for a very long time and have lots to share about how rum has changed over the years, and share with us some of the things that they've worked on. And this particular interview with Patrick Mayers is one that I've been looking forward to doing for several years now, actually. Patrick and I have become good friends and chat quite a bit, and he is a wealth of information. So Patrick is the former, not only the former managing director of the West India Rum Refinery, later the West Indies Rum Distillery, but also still the chairman emeritus of WIRSPA. So it's my extreme honor to have Patrick Mayers on the show. Patrick, welcome.
I'm gonna step out, so leave you guys alone.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matt. Good to be with you again, and good to be talking with you today.
Yeah, so I think you wanted to start out before we jump into the interview. I think you wanted to share a statement with everybody.
Yes, I think this would be appropriate because my period as chairman and involvement in the rum industry stretched for many years. But I wanted to make it clear I was not the leading light. I was not always the guy out front leading the charge. It was a really great team effort, and I think that needs to be appreciated by all of our listeners. And I also want to make one point that my job as chairman of managing director and eventually I think chairman of West Indies Rum Distillery was not the job that I was main job at the time. I was working with Goddard Enterprises, a large local conglomerate, and they own a multiplicity of businesses. It's unusual. And West India, they had controlling interest in West Indies Rum refinery cum distillery, and at one point in the game that was put into my division, so it was never a full time. But I had been in rum from my early days, and it continued to be in rum through other involvements, and therefore it was logical at the time to ask me to take that on when Goddard had control over the West Indies Rum Distillery, or refinery as it was known then. So my statement is really just to basically confirm what I've been saying to you. And I would like to say that my experience of working in part of the rum industry, and particularly through some of the many challenges that WIRSPA and the members faced over the last 50 years, a period of great change for us in the Caribbean and in the wider world, and in particular in the spirits world. It was political change, it was economic change, and it was change in consumer preferences. These for me were very enlightening. It was a wonderful learning experience, and it was quite fulfilling in the end because we were able to achieve quite a few objectives to try and keep our industry up and running and going well. So that basically was my position, in that I wanted to make it clear I wasn't there throughout the whole thing. All right. I must stress that I was not directly involved during all of the period. I've said that. So let us move forward and say that what was achieved by WIRSPA over that period, not by me alone, but by many others as well, could not have been possible without the full collaboration and support of many different people working in close collaboration. And I want to stress that, working in close collaboration. These included governments of the region, both at the political and the technical levels, including the regional negotiating machinery and the negotiators, and the accredited diplomatic representatives of our individual countries in various marketplaces, as well as the WIRSPA contracted people who we had in the various key markets that who worked for WIRSPA part-time, but who had a watching brief, we would call it, to provide advice in our key overseas markets, and more importantly, to alert us to developments that may be taking place that could be negatively or positively affect where we were trying to go. I think this needs to be put into context that we are thousands of miles away from most of our big markets in some cases, and that early warning system has served us well over the years. Above all else, the willingness of all WIRSPA members to work together with the primary goal of ensuring the successful future of our regional rum industry. It was a real team effort. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the many people who gave me personally valuable advice and support. Along also my employer throughout many of these years, Goddard Enterprises Limited, where in addition to my role as a director and head of a division of that organization, they allowed me and encouraged me in my efforts on WIRSPA's behalf. And I think that at this point, I should point out that many of the chairmen of WIRSPA, to the best of my knowledge, we worked there, and our companies didn't get recompense for it. There was a lot of willingness by the companies in the region to allow its key employees who were involved to participate. I would like to also say that the chairman that we had, many of the chairmen we had over the years did a splendid job. And I'm very glad to see Kamal in the chair, as he has been in recent years. But I want to stress that Kamal is no new person. Kamal, I recall Kamal from some of my earliest days. So Kamal was there and he knows what the issues are. I would like to make a special mention of Vaughn Rennick and his team at WIRSPA, over at the WIRSPA office, who have worked so very hard to make the implementation of the EU assistance program a success, and who after 20 years, along with Caroline Doyle, have continued to keep WIRSPA's flag flying and flying high. Well done, Vaughn. Just keep things going. We must remember that there are always going to be new battles that will arise, new challenges to fight. This is what we are going through, maybe a bit of a breather, but there's lots more coming as the world is in a period of major change. And our biggest goal must be to keep Caribbean rum in the place, win the drinks industry worldwide that it so well deserves. Remember, we've been making rum in this part of the world for nearly, or I believe in some cases, over 400 years. Lastly, I think this is very important, particularly to those members of WIRSPA who would know some of the detail. I want to say a very special thank you to my long-standing secretary, Una Mengo, who is now significantly older than I think most of us and in retirement. Una was unbelievable. She loved the helping WIRSPA in every way she could, and she went on after retirement to support us in every way. And especially, I want to give a thanks to my wife, who up to this past week was helping me to prepare for this interview. She is the one, and I think some of the WIRSPA members who know her too, and know her very well, will understand the pressure that I come under from time to time to call it quits. But she always is there at my side to support me. And it's virtually 60 years now. We've been 60 odd years now. She's been there to help. And I am overjoyed and pleased and thankful for the help that I've had from her and the rest of the team. So thank you.
Okay. So thank you for that, Patrick. I know you wanted to do that, and we worked together to craft a statement. So with that in mind, let's now jump into the interview section. So I'd like to start, as we traditionally do, by having you tell us just a little bit about your early life and your family's connection to the sugar industry.
Well, it's an interesting life. Sometime during the early part of the Second World War, Trinidad, which was a big sugar growing country like Barbados, even though Barbados is very much smaller, Trinidad became a part of what was known as the Lend-Lease program, arrangement between the United States and the UK or United Kingdom. And as a result, Trinidad became very militarized. They had large areas They were leased for bases, mainly to American forces, but also there were British and other forces that were there. And I think this had a lot to do with the oil in the area, the Panama Canal, and other vital interests that needed to be secured. So Trinidad, growing up in Trinidad, was very different. Now, I was born in Barbados, and I am a Barbadian, and I'm proud to say that the only passport I've ever held is a Barbadian passport. But at some point in my early life, before I can remember, and at the time I mentioned, the early 40s, my father, who was a sugar chemist working in the sugar factories in Barbados, was offered a job in Trinidad. And the point was that a lot of the sugar people in the sugar area in Trinidad moved to work in higher paying and better jobs that were being offered as a result of the construction and other major activities to support the war effort that was taking place at the time. So we moved to Trinidad, and as far as I was concerned, Trinidad was my home, because during the war we didn't go too far, as you will appreciate. It's a funny thing. In Trinidad, in all my years, wherever I went, whatever I said, I was always called Bej or Bejan. When I came back to Barbados at 17, after my father's death, everybody here had called me Trini. And this should give you a feel for what the Caribbean is like. We love each other, but we all, looking to take the mickey out of each other whenever we get the chance. So it again emphasizes the ability that we at WIRSPA found to be able to work together irregardless. So that is basically the background. My father worked originally in a factory called Reform, which was owned at that time by the Grant family, a Trinidadian family. And he that was subsequently taken over by Usine St. Madeleine, which was at its time one of the largest factories in Trinidad. It had its own railway system. It had its own doctors and all the rest of it. I believe it was ultimately owned by Tate and Lyle. And so we became part of that wider organization. But I want to stress that this was out in the bush. And I remember well when the first fridge came and the first telephone came, and ultimately when we had electricity 24/7. So it was those early days, and it taught me a lot. So there we go. So you go on, Vaughn. That's very important. Right?
Okay. So
to make it clear that I was born there and I grew up there, but my background was in that sugar industry, and of course there was rum attached to the sugar industry in Trinidad too. So rum, even though it wasn't until later in my life that I got to know about rum, but we used to eat the hell out of the sugar, that's for sure, when we could get our hands on it.
Right. So let's move from Trinidad back to Barbados. When did you start working at the West India Rum Refinery, and how did you get that position? And what did you do when you first started?
Well, when my father died, my mother decided to return to Barbados. I was left in Trinidad to stay with friends and continue my schooling. And I had a very important exam to sit, because if I passed the exam, I would be able to get into the fifth form, or what we called the fifth form in those days. And if I did well and passed those exams, I'd been offered a scholarship of a sort with what now is UE Trinidad. It was called Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture then. So I stayed on in Trinidad. She packed up and went to Barbados. My brothers were all much younger than I was. and they were here and they went to school here, and so I was on my own there. I came back to Barbados for the Christmas holidays, interestingly, as a passenger on one of the sugar boats that was moving sugar from Trinidad to, I guess, United Kingdom or wherever, and it stopped in Barbados. And I came here, and the intention was to be here for the Christmas period, and also to participate in my father's burial, because he was born in Barbados but died in London, and they brought his ashes back. And I came here, and I found that, things were very unsettled with the family. We were trying to find our feet. My mother who had worked before they were married, but was back out working. And so, yes, I did pass my exams. I did get the promotion into the 5th form, but I decided that I would prefer to stay in Barbados and look for a job. And I had a first cousin, who had recently started to work at the West Indies Rum Refinery. And he told me about that job, and there were one or two others that you could apply for in other fields, but the one at the West India sounded exciting. And I applied, and I was offered that. And so that is how it started. It's very interesting that when I started at Hanshaw-Linnis at West Indies Rum Distillery, the title was Rum Store Clerk, and that was fine. It was a job, and it paid reasonably well, and I got on with life. But when I went to work there, everybody was referred to at my level as junior overseers, whatever that meant. But we got on with it, and we learned. That was the main thing. We were learning. We were being taught.
So what year was this that we're talking about here when you started?
I started at West Indies Rum Distillery in very early 1959.
Okay. And what was the distillery making at the time, or what kind of rum was the distillery making, and who were their primary customers?
West Indies at the time were making. They made a continuous type rum, which was reasonably light, but not what we would call very light in today's world. It was a move forward from the traditional pot stills, and they did have pot stills there as well, but their light rum had become quite popular on the island and with some of the overseas customers. So they primarily made light continuous and also pot still as well, which of course was, some people wanted pot still only, but quite often there was a blend of the two.
Okay, so was the rum being blended, like the pot and the column rum? Would that be blended at West Indies, or would the customers do that?
Well, in those days, you couldn't, West India, remember, everything that went on at that distillery was under very strict custom supervision, excise officers. I seem to remember there are at least 4 on duty at any one time, and everything was tightly controlled. And one of the things I understand is that in those days there were regulations that prevented the actual bottling of rum within a certain distance of a distillery. And whether that's so or not, Andrew Hassel at the distillery, I think he's a historian and that sort of thing, and he can check it, but I've heard that over and over again. So what basically happened was that West Indies produced the rum, but they sold it to the many, and there were many brand owners that existed in Barbados. Some of them had large volumes of rum that they bought with their brands, and some of them had you had smaller merchants who would buy a barrel or two, but they had their own brands as well. So at one point in the game, I think there may be, 20 or 30 brands of rum that were available in Barbados, but those brands normally carried the name of the person who who sold it or who bottled it and blended it. But if they use rum from the West Indies Rum Refinery, they were allowed to use or could use the name Stays, which was the name that the West India owned, because it goes back to the names of the two German gentlemen who I think originally got the distillery going in the late 1800s.
Right. So are these local brands, are there any names that people would recognize today?
Yes, there were many of the brands are disappeared, but some are there, and some are, I believe, slowly coming back. But you had Dorley's, you had Alan Arthur, you had ESA Fields, you had Perkins, a multiplicity of brands, and they were, some of them were quite large. Some of them contracted with West India to age rum for them. Some of them took the rum duty paid, so they didn't have to worry about the cost of aging and the ullage, but they were normally the smaller ones. But there were many different brands, and I believe West India has a collection of some of the early labels. But as the whole, many of these merchants primarily sold to the small country shops, who most of them had small bars attached to them, and therefore, as the supermarket industry developed, people started shopping at the supermarkets and so on. Those small country shops, to some degree, settled, but they are still there, and a lot of that goes on still. But the brands that are there now are the ones I call. Now, you must remember that at that point there were other distilleries functioning on the island, and one was, of course, Mount Gay, who had quite a good reputation, and they had separated their bottling and branding and distribution of their own brand, Mount Gay, from the environs of the distillery. So they really were ahead of most of the producers trying to also establish their own rums, right, own brand. And that was done through a separate company. And I think the ownership was slightly different to right, those that owned the distillery.
Right. We've talked with, I think when we talked with Frank Ward about this, he sort of.
Yes, Frank, that is correct.
Right. So who else, your international customers, like, who are some of the, are there any big international customers we would recognize?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the West Indies business was really export. And I say it was bulk, but really it was quite often, it was rums that were blended to various specifications, continuous on pot still, sometimes all of one, sometimes all of another. But it was customers like we shipped rum to the liquor control boards of Canada, who did their own bottling under their own brands. There was quite a lot of rum going to Australia, of all places, and that is an interesting story. There were substantial quantities going to the UK. Bermuda, believe it or not, was quite a good market for Barbados rum at the time. And then, of course, all the other Caribbean islands would import as well. But I want to make it clear that there was most of the rum, Mount Gay were selling primarily concentrating on their own brands, and West India were working with those people who were buying from them and supplying them with the rum that they needed to develop their brand. So West India did have a brand and still has a brand, but they were not really in the bottling at that early stage. Later on, when changes were made to the law, of course, West India started to bottle as well.
Right. I think you mentioned that ED&F Man was one of the customers in that stage.
Yeah, well, ED&F Man, I understand, were the sole purveyors for nearly 200 years or more for rum for the Royal Navy. and that goes back, and I think you've written about the history of that, and that goes back a long time. And that rum, as I understand it, was a blend of rum from Caribbean countries, and I believe that several, Jamaica, Guyana, Barbados, Trinidad, and maybe others, were suppliers to EDF Man, who in turn had the responsibility for bottling it and selling it to the Navy.
Right.
But that, and West Indies, when I was there in 59, 60 era, there were, we would get an order every year for a certain number of barrels and from EDF Man for the Navy, and it was very specific. It had to be blended at the strength they wanted, which was higher than the normal drinking strength, and also colored to the degree they wanted. And that rum was then put into barrels and shipped off to the UK. But of course, a lot of that came to an end, or it all came to an end in I think 1970 or just before,
Right.
when the Navy decided that they weren't going to give the tot out anymore. Okay.
Right. So when did you become the managing director of West Indies?
That was a long time later. There was a gap in between, and I when I was looking at your outline, I said, this is going to be a difficult one to get across, because in 1962, let me just go back to West India for one moment.
Sure.
They had a marvelous program for the young juniors, as we call them, and you worked your way through each department in the distillery, the receiving the molasses, the propagation, the yeast areas where they grew their own specific yeast, and then into the distillery, and then on to the rum stores and so on. So even in those days, they put the juniors through a very structured program of learning about all the various aspects. So I guess by late 61, 62, I was getting a bit restless. I felt that I needed to look around and see what I could do, because I could see myself moving on in rum, but I saw that it would probably take a lot of years, because the organization was well structured and there were a lot of people who were older than me, and so it would have taken a time. I was anxious to get on with my life, and so I was looking around, and I undertook a job which was a company that has been established to do building supplies. Now, one of the leading lights in that company was a young JC, Junior Chamber of Commerce man. He was a passionate member, and he and the JC decided they were going to put on a big trade fair in Barbados to expose Barbadians and others to our local products. And he said to me, look, why don't you come and work with us and go out there and try and sell? Because you had to go around and persuade businesses to take booths at this exhibition. And so I said, fine, wonderful. I never sold a thing to anybody in my life, but I didn't really know what I was in for. And it was interesting. And my first call that I was told to make was to Mr. Darnley Ward, who would be family to Frank, to Frank's family. And he was running the distribution and marketing side of Mount Gay. And I went in to see him, and I talked with him for about an hour. And at the end of it, he said he was very gracious and very kind. He was a wonderful old man. And he basically said no. And I left very downhearted and said, well, should I really have left the distillery? Should this really be the route that I'm taking? But there was no turning back. There was no back door in those days, and certainly not in my life. So I persisted. And, over the years, as I became more involved in the rum industry and the local rum association called the Rum Committee, the Montgay became a very strong member, and Mr. Ward, Mr. Darnley Ward, and his brother, who ran the distillery in St. Lucie, were big supporters of our association. And I really got to know Mr. Darnley a bit better, and he could not have been more gracious and kind. So he was really a wonderful old gentleman of those days that we would all wish to have around us today.
Right. So you, as I understand it, you eventually went to work for Goddard and
Well,
came back into it.
I don't want to bore you with this story, but basically the business I was working for was not, after the trade fair was over, it was wandering a bit, and I got an offer to go to work in a wholesale distribution business. And it had its own brand of rum called Proverbs Rum. And they sold that, and it was sold to the same country shops and wider population. And basically, but I wasn't involved directly in the rum there. I learned more about it, but I was there. And then there was also a subsidiary of that company, or not a subsidiary, but a sister company called James Innes, which really was an agency where they had the agencies for products like Kellogg's Corn Flakes and Mars bars, things like that. And things were changing in Barbados. Supermarkets were opening, and there was a need from people who own brands to have their distributors get out and start selling them direct to the supermarkets and learning about merchandising and all of that. So I went into that part of the organization called James H. Innes. That expanded quite rapidly with the change in times. And eventually that became part of Hanschel Innes. Hanschel Larsen was a local company that operated in spirits. That was their big business. They had, one of their brands was Cockspur. They had other brands, but they also were ships agents and other businesses, but they were not involved in the food. And they were actually controlled by Ocean Steamship of Liverpool. They had been locally owned, but Ocean had become involved. And Ocean then were looking around to widen the base of that company. And so they came along and made an offer for the shares in James H. Innes, of which I had become a shareholder. And we merged or joined with them and became Hanschel Innes. And that then got me very involved in rum again, but on the branded side. And that is when I had my first involvement with WIRSPA, because of the that company, Hanschel Innes, was actually, because of their large rum involvement, also members of what was known as the Barbados Rum Committee. And so that is how that was my start, my second time around in rum. And that would be.
Yeah. So what year did you actually formally sort of become the managing year? What year was that?
What year was it? What?
Did you become the managing director of West Indies?
Oh, that came later. We're getting there. We're nearly there. Okay. But what basically happened was that Hanschel Innes, when we became part of it, became Hanschel Innes, that would have been in the early 70s. And then later on, towards the latter part of the 70s, the Caribbean was going through a lot of change. And the big companies, overseas companies, were sort of having a second look at whether Caribbean was the right place to invest. And I don't know the background to it, but I was actually in the UK on a business visit, and I got a call from the head of Goddard Enterprises, which is a large, widely involved company here in Barbados and other Caribbean countries in a multiplicity of businesses. And I got a call saying that they were going to be hoping to buy the Hanschel Innes business from Ocean Steamship. and would I come back to Barbados for a meeting? So you can understand my concern. Was I going to be out of a job? Well, when I got back, I was told that they were keen that I should come along and be part of the deal. And so at that point, I became involved in Goddard's Enterprises, which you can find. We are now probably the largest publicly owned and traded company in Barbados. And they also were in the rum business and were shareholders, not controlling, but were shareholders at the West Indies Rum Distillery. And their chairman, Mr. Victor Goddard, and then subsequently Sir John Goddard, is one of his nephews, were the managing directors, or chairman, sorry, of the distillery over those years, even though at the early days they didn't have controlling interest, but that came later.
So to go back to the earlier question, so when were you finally given, what year were you given responsibility?
Okay, well, when I became part of the Goddard organization, I eventually, or soon after they took over Hansel Innes, the company Goddard's did major restructuring, and there were 4 operating divisions which handled into which there were a number of like or similar companies under the control of a divisional manager. And so I became a divisional manager of Goddard Enterprises, and included in that was the original Hansel Innes business. There were a number of other businesses, ship chandlery and other businesses that we were involved in, small manufacturing. But there was this involvement. Goddard's had at that point, I believe, either acquired, because remember, West Indies was a public company and the shares were traded publicly and quite widely. And Goddard's had been able to acquire a controlling interest. And I was asked or told, take it as you go, that West Indies would be a good addition to widen the division I was responsible for because of my previous knowledge of West India and work in rum with Hansel. So that was my involvement there. By that time I had been asked to become a director of Goddard Enterprises. It was a public company at that time. So that was how we went. And so I think, reading a bit of your stuff, I think there's a misunderstanding that when I went to West India, that was my full-time job. It certainly was not. These in the Caribbean and in the smaller islands, you just aren't able to focus on one business alone. If you want to grow and become, grow your businesses, you have to be willing to diversify. And certainly Goddard's was a very diversified business. And that is how they eventually became majority shareholders and then outright shareholders to a very high degree. And I say outright, I think eventually they were never able to find all the shareholders because many of them went back over a century, but it was done properly, and Goddard's eventually became the primary shareholder in West Indies Rum Distillery. But I went back there at a time when things were changing in the world. I mean, the liquor boards in Canada were sort of phasing out some of their own proprietary brands. You had issues with, quotas being introduced in the EU market. There were difficulties worldwide in that changing environment. And the distillery had gone through a very good period, but then they needed to have a new look at where they should go, both locally and overseas. And that was put into my division, and that was my brief: go see what you could do. But
I think that sort of leads into the next question, which is, so West Indies went through some growth, large growth in the 1990s. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, a very interesting story, Matt. That was part of my brief. Don't go there. I wasn't told, go look for this man or that man. It was go see what you could do to widen its base and its customer base and so on. And one day I was in England on company business in London. I'd been there for two days, and I got a call from the office in Barbados saying that there was a gentleman who had come to visit the distillery, and he wanted to get samples of rum, and he wanted to see me, or he wanted to see the MD of the distillery. So I stopped what I was doing. I may even have left some of my clothes in London because I was planning a 2-week trip that included Europe as well. And I rushed back to Barbados on the first flight I could get. I met with this gentleman who said that he turned out to be the managing director, I believe, of IDV, but he didn't disclose all the details of anything. He just said that his company was looking at developing some new brands which involved rum, and he was traveling through some of the Caribbean islands to get samples of rum to see if they could find a suitable supplier, right, or a suitable type, I should say, of rum, that the kind of rum they were looking for, which would have been a light type rum, okay? Mm-hmm. Which, right. By then there were plenty of choices. Barbados was not unique in that regard. So we met, and he had his samples, and away he went, and we didn't hear anything more for several months. And then I got another call saying this gentleman was here in Barbados and he wanted to see me again, or see the MD of the distillery. And this time around, he disclosed who he was, what companies were involved, and he said that they had a brand, or they developed a brand, or were developing a brand called Malibu, which very much was it wasn't a rum per se, but it was a rum flavored
rum spirit drink.
Yeah, and you couldn't call it rum per se, but it was a rum drink, and they were looking for a source, and they had done a lot of checking and testing, and they felt that the rum that the West Indies Rum Distillery was making would suit their purpose. So the name of the game was to sit down and see whether we could make a deal to supply the quantity, to supply the quality consistently, and to do whatever we needed to do, because yes, the West Indies was going forward again with new customers, but this was a lifeline to some degree that we needed to hold on to, because it gave us what seemed to be a good long-term opportunity. So that was how that happened, and we talked about it, and we agreed in principle where we were going to go. I jumped on a plane, flew back to London after 2 or 3 days, and continued my business trip. And then from there, the rest of it is history, really.
Right. And I think at this point in history, you were already, I think may already have even been the WIRSPA chairman by this point. So let's go back a little bit. So tell us sort of like your entry point into WIRSPA. What were the first things you did in a WIRSPA capacity?
Well, let's be frank. WIRSPA, you must understand that the very complex, even island by island, country by country here in this CARICOM region as such. So in Barbados, that was the people that served on the rum, what was known as the Barbados Rum Committee, which was the local rum association, were not only the distilleries, but also the people that had the brands.
Right.
Okay. Because brands is what it was all about, really.
Right.
And so my involvement with Cockspur through Hans Schulz and had involved me quite heavily in rum. And I was when the rum committee got going here, it had been going for a while, but when they needed to bring someone else in or replace whoever it was that represented Hans Schulz before, I was the person that was asked to serve. So my first memory of WIRSPA was, I must say, it wasn't at the very beginning. I remember about 1976, 78, there used to be an opportunity, I think once a year, to try and get our major customers, in particularly the United Kingdom and Canada, together in the Caribbean, so that they could, and they used to visit the various distilleries, but they would go around and meet and discuss with the distilleries their supply problems. And it was a very useful exercise, those meetings, because we learned not only about maybe selling rum, but also about some of the technical issues and also some of the international problems that would crop up as we went along in market access. Right. So that was really how I got in. I became the representative of Hanschel on the Barbados Rum Committee, which in turn was the WIRSPA member for Barbados.
Right.
Not me, but the Rum Committee, as it was called.
So when was your first term? What year did you first become chairman of WIRSPA?
Well, let me say this, that we used to have meetings probably once, twice a year of WIRSPA, and therefore, as the representative from Barbados, the chairman of the Rum Committee in Barbados, I would be one to attend. However, I want to make it clear that WIRSPA always operated a very open, transparent house. So other members of the rum industry in Barbados were also invited to attend. But there was one person who was the designated official representative. So I would have gone to a number of WIRSPA meetings, and in the early 1980s, probably around the time that I became involved in West India, because then by that time I was more involved in rum in both the marketing side and the trading side, as well as the production. And so there was I was on WIRSPA's board. I used to meet be there whenever they had meetings. And one of the issues that came, or the opportunities that came, was the CBI arrangement, Caribbean Basin Initiative, which was announced by President.
That's actually what I was gonna segue to was that you were chairman for 3 times. You served 3 terms as chairman, including the last time was 10 years, which was you and I think Frank Ward have tied for longest. But over your times as chairman, can you tell us about some of the key initiatives that you worked on, including the CBI? Start wherever you like.
Okay, let me say this just to clarify. Lloyd Forbes was the chairman of WIRSPA at the time that the whole CBI issue became a big opportunity.
Right. In CBI, for those who are not familiar, Caribbean Basin Initiative, which was I could go into detail, but I don't think we have the time. But it was an effort to try and encourage more commercial activity and production and whatever in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Caribbean areas in particular, and Central America. And this was during the Reagan administration, basically. Yeah.
Yes, it was an initiative of the Reagan administration. Now, in those days, it was normal for the chairman of WIRSPA to serve 2 years, and then it would change to someone else. Because remember, in most cases, it was the company that whoever the chairman was, whoever the company he worked for, would often pay for the chairman's cost of travel or whatever. It was that sort of arrangement. WIRSPA didn't have a big pocket, Right. So anyway, the first thing was we went off to Washington to do a trip to try and see what we could learn about the CBI. Lloyd was the chairman at the time. I had just become deputy chairman. We went to Washington, and the first thing we learned and were told by our individual country representatives there, some of our ambassadors, gentlemen, this is a different system. And you all have to understand that at the end of the day, you're going to have somebody who knows their way around that Congress and the Senate and who understands how the system works. And so one of the first things we had to do was go look for someone. And that is very much credit should be given to Lloyd. We eventually linked up with a young lawyer who was working with one of the recognized law firms in Washington. And he had been in the Carter administration on the trade side, so he knew a bit about it. And he was the one then that gave us the insights into what we had to do to work, to try and lobby, because for us to go into a political, elected political representative's office and be able to openly talk about and try to influence a particular scenario, whether particularly in terms of international trade and so on, was not really in our system, in our Westminster system, the done thing at the time, you know?
Right. So I just want to add really quickly, we have interviewed Lloyd also in our Icon series. So
I'm aware, I watched it.
We have this history from, sort of this various stories of people like you and Lloyd and Evan Brown and Yusu of this period. So go on, though.
Anyway, Lloyd did a very good job. I supported him when I needed to, but he really did the running on that one, and I was not that involved. But what happened was that the complexion of the Senate and the House changed in terms of who was in control of each part of government during the second Reagan term, after President Reagan had won a second term. And the bill that had been agreed or discussed between in the Congress with regards rum, because remember, our problem was that when the bill was first announced, rum was supposed to be given duty-free treatment into the U.S. But there was opposition to that coming from those U.S. territories that were also producing rum in a big way. And so in the first go around, we were able to get a bill. I believe Lloyd got a bill that would have allowed, if it had been able to be passed in the first Reagan term, we would have had duty-free treatment for our rum from the Eastern Caribbean. But because of the change of the complexion of the Congress, that bill, this again is a system. That bill, I don't want to use the word died, but it was put aside because you then had to start from scratch all over. So Lloyd did a good job getting that through and up and running, and we all thought, hooray, we've made it, only to find out a few months later that when the new Congress got going, we were dealing with a different arrangement. And I think basically the House had become Democratic. The Senate remained Republican. So it was a new job to start all over, and it was started from scratch. And I then had become chairman. And I tell you, those 3 years that I was chairman for that go around were some of the most interesting I've ever experienced, because that system of being able to go in and convince people. And I must tell you, that is what we had to do. We had to go and we had to make our case. And the thing that really, I think, surprised us all was that at least we could get a hearing. It didn't mean that people would agree with us, but we could get a hearing. Right. And to us, that was important. And then the other thing was that there were also visits by some of the members of Congress to the Caribbean when the whole CBI bill became a serious consideration. So you had visits to the Caribbean as well. And that also was important because it gave us the opportunity to show the congressman and others that there was a real need for this sort of assistance to help the rum industry, and specifically, but other industries to get going again and start earning foreign exchange and foreign exchange and creating employment, because that was what it was all about, really.
Right. So beyond the CBI, so if we think of CBI as a program from the United States, there was also Lome in there for many years. Tell us about Lome.
Well, that came later. CBI, when CBI was over, I had done my 3 years, 1 year more than we normally did in those days, and I then someone else became chairman, and I couldn't continue to play a role because it was important for Barbados, which had a good rum industry, to make certain that we were part of the process of getting wider access, because our distilleries in these islands, in most islands, the amount of rum we produce cannot be consumed locally. If we don't have an export market, we don't have a business. And if we want to be successful long term, we have to have much more of that volume that we are exporting going into brands where you got a higher return. And also the brands, you have to have some form of ownership or control, not control, but ownership, rather than just be selling bulk commodity rum to someone who is then going to take it and age it and sell it under their own brand. So that was part of the problem. I will say that there were some of our producers, Jamaica was one, Ray Nephew, Montgay was another, and there were one, Angostura in Trinidad. They all had brands in the international market, but most of the other producers were very dependent on, or having to depend on their, what I call their commodity rum or their bulk rum. And so that, in a way, was where we were trying to move. Now, just let me make it clear, Malibu was like a halfway house, because we were selling rum that ultimately went into a brand, and we were able to capitalize to some extent on that. And that was a big help to West Indies Rum Distillery along the way.
So, okay, so to come back to Lome, and you've been talking again. You were talking about how CBI and as well as Lome were attempts to sort of help the Caribbean economy sort of grow out of sort of not having sufficient money, not having access to bigger markets. Can you tell us a little bit about the Lome side of things?
Yeah, the Lome side of things was, as you say, that came in 75, 76. It involved over 70 developing countries in the African, Caribbean, and Pacific region. And that also, rum was a big issue. It was an attempt to allow much more product from the CBI areas, not CBI, the Lome countries who were participating, to enter the European market on preferential arrangements, duty free. But again, we run up against a problem, because you have to realize that within the ACP, you have rum producers, and quite a few of them. But you also, within the EU, you also had rum producers in the French countries, the French parts of the French Republic, and you even had rum producers in the Portuguese areas and so on. So we ran into the same sort of problem where there was opposition to giving rum duty-free treatment straight off the bat. So we had to lobby, and we had to fight, and we had to work hard to try and convince. And that was a long battle. Now, again, at the early part, I personally would not have been directly involved. The chairman, whoever it was at that time, would have been involved. And at some point, I became chairman again. And it fell to me to continue that effort, because that was a long effort. And it involved an awful lot of convincing and working with all different interests to try and get rum a square deal in the EU. So that was a big one, I'm afraid, because prior to Lome, Europe had been a significant market for Caribbean rum, for ACP Caribbean rum.
Right. So, can you tell us now about the Canadian side of things and like the challenges?
Canada is a different issue. Canada had always been a big importer of Caribbean rum from this part of the Caribbean, and going back maybe even a few years ago, if you looked at the stats, the consumption of rum in Canada as a percentage of per capita consumption was much higher, maybe 15-20%, as opposed to 7 or 8% in North America, in the United States, and around that level in Europe. Of course, the Canadian population wasn't that big, but the market in Canada was quite tightly regulated because their constitution allowed the individual provinces, in most cases, to have the right to sell and control the sale of spirits and wines and spirits. It varied from province to province. And they also had their own facilities, in some cases, to bottle. So it was an issue of trying to get some form of access, reasonable, fair access at the various liquor boards. But the problem was that the liquor boards, as regards to liquor and spirits, were pretty independent of. They didn't. They had a great deal of independence in their decision making and who they listed and who they dealt with. So basically, the provincial governments had almost as much say, or they had a significantly more say than you would normally expect in an open market. And the federal government really, as much as they may have wished to have supported and helped the Caribbean, which they were very definitely willing to do, it was difficult to them to dictate to the provinces what they should buy and where they should buy it from. So that was another battle. We made some progress in 76. It was around the time, one of my second terms as thing, but we had been making progress all along, but it was a hard grind. And we did make some progress when Prime Minister Mulroney visited the Caribbean and had got a first-hand look at what the situation here was. And we were able to appeal to him, and he did announce at a joint meeting between Canada and the CARICOM in Nassau that they were going to improve the access to Caribbean rum, or rum from the ACP, from the Caribbean, CARICOM region. And that was followed through, and we did end up getting much better access to the Canadian market, but their regulations were still tough, and it wasn't easy. And of course, the liquor boards controlled the distribution through their shops, and they also controlled the markups that you were allowed to make and that sort of thing. So that was another battle, and that battle has got much better, but we ain't there yet. We still have a little way to go. Our present chairman, Kamal, will know a lot more about that issue than I would, because he worked hard on that one, very hard.
Right. So speaking of battles, as you say, one of the things that we have talked about in previous Icon series or interviews is sort of the ultimate, maybe the ultimate battle, which was the kind of the end of the Lome agreements and the 0 for 0 and the agreements between the EU and America that in short led WIRSPA and the Caribbean rum producers, its members, to feel that they had sort of received some unfair treatment, and basically you, as I understand it, like several people, including you and Dr. Persaud, Evan Brown, basically had to go to Europe and basically educate the people there to create what became, and basically to work on what later became the rum sector program. Can you tell us about just some stories from those days of working with Yesu and Evan?
Let me start by saying that in the beginning, and I can go back to when we all went up to Washington as a crowd to try and lobby for CBI. You know, we were all competitors. We were all sort of looking over the shoulders of each other as competitors. And as we went forward with the experiences that we had in other markets and then in Europe, it became very, very clear that we were not going to really make too much progress unless we started to work together. And WIRSPA as such, as an organization, became much more structured. And one of the things, and a lot of work was done by the various chairmen over the years to try and encourage a much greater working together. Okay, we all have common issues in various markets. They're common to all of us, but we also are competitors. Let us find a way to put that aside or to work along with that and break into these big markets that we needed to expand into. So that was the background of what was going on. And so as far as Lome was concerned, we had at the beginning, rum was, the UK market was open to us because traditionally that had been our major market, but we had markets in Germany and other parts of the EU. Remember, the EU was not the size it is today. The number of countries were a lot less. But the negotiations in 1975-76, which led to the Lome Convention, there was an effort to try and put rum or to provide some protection for EU rum producers. And fair enough, that's the name of the game at the time. But we were allowed a quota system. Eventually, a quota system was put in place. And yes, you had a fairly large quota for major markets like the UK and Germany, who had been traditional buyers of rum from the Caribbean. But then there were other markets in Europe, and Europe was expanding rapidly. You had countries from Eastern Europe coming in where they were producing a lot, or they were selling a lot of products that went under the guise of rum, but they were not actually rum per se. They were heavy rum that was imported from Caribbean and wherever, that was blended with local spirits and so on. And that was fair enough. But in the meantime, the EU had introduced their definitions for rum. And those definitions were basically saying that if you're going to call something rum, it has to be the fermented distillate of the sugarcane. And so we had a job not only in trying to be allowed more easier access, but also to be able to get regulations or with regards to definition and so on that would allow us to build our markets. Now, the big problem in the Lome was the quota system, and that never really worked particularly well because it always seemed, certainly if you wanted to build a brand, you had to have a pretty steady supply of rum to be able to meet your retail customers' demands. And that was very difficult where you had a quota system that was going expiring every 3 months or whatever it was. So we had to work on that. We had at the same time the issues with definition. We had to deal with trying to sell more rum to the new members of the EU. So that was an ongoing battle, and it took a long time and a lot of work. And what WIRSPA basically did at that point in time was agree that we would form a committee. We called it a negotiating committee. And that committee originally was Evan Brown from Jamaica, Isu from Trinidad, from Guyana, and myself from Barbados. And during that time, I had once again started to serve as chairman. And what we did was we worked together. We had regular WIRSPA meetings here in the Caribbean. We worked together. We agreed a strategy. We worked through our diplomatic representatives. We worked through our regional governments. We worked through people like the RNM to try and make the case that we needed a square deal when the Lomé Convention came to an end. And that was a battle. We obviously had opposition from our French colleagues, but eventually we were able to sit down around a table and talk to them and explain to them why we could survive and why they could survive together without fighting one another morning, noon, and night. And
Right.
we were able to do that, and out of it came now there was one hiccup there, and that is that rum was on quota until the end of 1999. But there was something called the 0 for 0 agreement, which was negotiated between the US and the European Union in the mid-90s to do with exchange of information technology. And apparently one of the trade-offs in that agreement when that was being negotiated was given access to rum from the US market on better conditions before, I believe, the Lomé Convention would have ended. So for us, we had a problem because we were looking forward to the end of Lomé so that we would have a free market in Europe to be able to go and build our brands and increase our volumes. But we had this other development, and so we had to work very hard to try and find a way. And that actually brought us together to some degree with our French producers, and we signed a number of accords with them. And they were not that we wouldn't compete with one another. We certainly did continue to compete, but that we would work together where it was practical and legally possible to try and make certain that they continued their preferences and that we would have some of the barriers that we were up against removed. And so that was a very interesting time.
Right.
There is one thing, and I tried to cover it before. I think it's important. I mentioned earlier about us having someone in the US who was keeping an eye out for us in CBI. Well, we found that system of having someone representing WIRSPA who was familiar with the trade issues and who had a watching brief and who could keep us informed and in cases give us early warning for various initiatives that might have been in the works that might have affected our efforts to open these markets and have better trade. And we found that in Europe that became very, very important, and we did use very effectively our representative there, David Jessup, who worked diligently. He had other responsibilities, but he certainly did a very good job for us on rum, and he became very familiar with the workings of Brussels and all the rest of it, which was a bit of a minefield in the beginning for us.
Right. So I want to jump ahead now to the rum sector program. So the outcome of this work that you and Yusu and Evan and many others did eventually led to basically a $70 million grant from the European Union to the rum makers of CARIFORUM, I believe at the time, to the rum makers.
CARIFORUM.
Yeah, CARIFORUM. I know it's CARIFORUM now. I wasn't sure if it was CARICOM at the time. But to briefly summarize it, that the purpose of this program was to help the rum makers elevate, transition to premium rum, to create better, more environmental friendly distilleries, bottling, basically to help them become more competitive in the global market, move away from bulk rum and towards premium branded products. And that responsibility for distributing this money fairly across the various rum producers fell, legally fell to, I believe, CARICOM or CARIFORUM, but ultimately the day-to-day responsibility fell to WIRSPA to oversee that program, WIRSPA and the WIRSPA chairman. And you were the chairman at the time. So tell us what that was like.
let me just make one point that I think has been overlooked maybe. This program that we were able to negotiate, was a program of cost sharing. So Von Rennick would have the final numbers, but there was a matching grant program, and it wasn't across the board. There were various windows. There were windows for modernization. There were windows for waste treatment. There were windows for research. There were windows for marketing. And each of these windows had certain limits that would allow the EU to only provide X number of dollars. So it was a cost sharing. And Vaughn will tell you, but I think that in the end, it worked out very much that our own producers who benefited from this what turned out to be a very successful program, I believe, was that more or less a 50-50 split between what we got from the EU, which we will be forever thankful for, but it was very tightly monitored and reviewed and kept under. I mean, we had our own auditors. Well, first of all, we had to set up a formal office, and some of the EU funding, some of it was there to allow a small office that would oversee the project. CARICOM, you're correct. It was EU CARIFORUM, and CARIFORUM in turn to WIRSPA, but WIRSPA was the implementing agency. And it was there's a clause in there that says that WIRSPA, which by then had become very much a formal organization, had to, they were responsible for the implementation, and the chairman, particularly, whoever that was at the time, would be the man to sort of to take the rap if things went wrong.
Right.
So,
and as I understand it, it was at that point that's when Vaughn came on board to help see this.
Well, no. What happened was that the rules were there; they were set in, and the agreement was signed. That itself is an interesting story. We all heard that they were about to sign it in Georgetown. We were invited, and Evan and myself and one other jumped on a plane, flew down to Georgetown, went to the meeting one early morning, and then flew back out. But we then had to office, and there was some funding that was available for that. I was asked, by that time I had retired from my day-to-day position at Goddard Enterprises, still remained on the board, but wasn't involved in the operational side of things. I was non-executive, and basically I had the time, and I was asked to help for the next 3 or 4 months. But the rules were very strict. Everybody who we were told, there were advisors who told us, basically there was a whole program, and I think if you haven't seen it, you need to see it, where it laid out clearly the various positions that would be there. It was a small team that was put together, but it really, the accounting requirements, the reporting requirements, but most importantly, the process for getting a project approved was all laid out. It was all there, and I must tell you that it was very, very interesting for me, because I was looking forward to what I hoped to be a final retirement after many years. But I got into this, and I learned probably more about the rules and regulations and all aspects of these aid projects than I ever dreamt would be possible. We had our own auditors. We had EU auditors who would come from time to time, a company that was appointed to come whenever they felt like to oversee what we were doing. And then ultimately there was the EU main auditing that they did. So it was very tightly controlled. And I must tell you that I think that in the end, it brought some serious, it helped the rum industry forget all the money we got was extremely useful. And it did what we wanted to do in most cases. and it was widely spread out. It wasn't confined to just a few of our bigger members. It was quite wide. Vaughn has all the details. But
I will mention very quickly. There's in the WIRSPA chapter of my book, I actually give examples of some of the programs and show sort of how widely it's spread across many different producers and responsible for things. For example, the new column distillation at Clarendon, for example. So there are examples out there. If people are curious, there are examples out there.
Yeah, but you remember, before you could apply for a project if you were eligible, but you also, that project then had to be reviewed by some of the staff that worked in the office, a small staff, and there were people that we could bring in. We were allowed to, who had been designated by the commission, who could be in the agreement, who, if you needed somebody specific to waste treatment or distillation, those people were named, and you could bring those people in, and they were tremendously helpful in to our many members and in helping them to identify what was needed and where best. And we had some interesting surprises that some of the things that we thought were major problems turned out to be not so big, and where there were problems coming down the road which we weren't fully aware of, we became aware of. So that program was that really, at the end of the day, gave the ACP or gave the Caribbean rum industry a huge leg up. But it was co-financing, and I must tell you that some of our members over the years, some of the beneficiaries, had to really swallow hard to convince their bankers and others to provide them with the finances that they needed for the matching grants. Okay, but it was right, because that made people take it very seriously. And the oversight that was done out of the WIRSPA office was excellent. So all I can tell you is that, I mean, I went with it, and I was the chairman until 2007, and at the end of the day, Frank took over from me and continued to do an excellent job. And I gather the reports that came out when the whole project was reviewed by the EU was outstanding. So I am proud and glad that we, as a team, very much a team, were able to make this happen. And all credit should go to Vaughn for helping that, and Frank and the others who were directly involved.
So we're just about near the end of our time. I have one question from one of our viewers, Dave Russell, my friend Dave, and then I would like you to wrap up with a final question from me. So the question from Dave is were all of the rums produced on your watch fermented from molasses, or was cane juice also used on occasion?
No, of course, cane juice could have been used and may well have been used. Some of the smaller distilleries that benefited from the EU program, for example. Also,
I think he's talking about at West Indies, primarily at West Indies.
At West Indies, not to my knowledge. No, at no time during but there is nothing to stop West Indies or any other distillery from using cane juice. Because the definition for rum makes it clear. It can be juice, it can be syrup, it can be molasses, and I believe, if sugar was cheap enough, you could use sugar. Yeah. I mean, it has to be 100% product of the sugar cane. So if that cane juice is from the sugar cane, then you ferment it and distill it under the conditions that the definition requires, then it is rum. You're going to get a different flavor or taste or whatever, but that is part of what we're all about, trying to make our products distinctive.
Right.
And
I know there's quite a bit of experimentation with cane juice, not only on our Barbados, like outside of the traditional, the French islands. There's quite a bit of exploration or using of cane juice, not only distilleries in Barbados, but around the Caribbean. It's sort of a sea change in how rum is being made.
No, I wouldn't say that. I think this has been going on for as long as rum was made. From my knowledge of reading the history of Barbados, It was even in the early days they were using cane juice as well as molasses or syrup or whatever. And certainly in the French islands, they do both, but they primarily use the cane juice, and they have very strict rules. But there's nothing wrong with using cane juice, but you can't decide you're going to use cane juice and then spike it with sugar made from beet or something like that. You know, that is very important. That rum must be the fermented product of the sugar cane, and you know, as I said to you recently, that there are some places now that are blending various rums, but we have to be careful to make certain that all the rums that go into those blends are made from the sugar cane, because you can make sugar from palm or you can make it from beet or whatever. Okay.
Right. Okay. So our final question is from me. So you've been in the rum industry now, or done things, been working within the rum industry for 63 years, at least 63 years now. Can you share us your sort of thoughts on how far Caribbean rum has come since you started, like where we are now versus when it started?
Matt, I am going to get in trouble with our Prime Minister, I believe, because she has a famous saying to us people in business and to the country in general: many hands working together make light work. Okay? So for me, that is a key message, but I would like to go beyond that. We have succeeded at WIRSPA, I think, up to this time by working together. We have various interests, including overseas interests. We have our local interests. At the end of the day, we have a unique product that has been produced for over 400 years. We have one of the EU funding project was designed to try and establish some mark to give us identity, make us unique. We must.
Is what the
that is correct. That is absolutely critical, that we try to identify our regions with rum. That rum is identified from regions from this part of the world. And one of the things we've always lacked traditionally has been the big investments that we need, to modernize, but more importantly, to build our brands. And that is where I think we are going. We have to form partnerships. We need to work. We need to work with good, solid people who will not just want to come and take, but who will stay and build and help us with the technologies and the rapidly changing market environments. All right. So I think that is, I started off by saying many hands working together make light work. And I believe that fundamentally. And I think that to a large extent is the success story behind WIRSPA. We worked together. We didn't start that way, but we learned that we couldn't survive unless we worked together. And I hope and pray that with Vaughn's leadership, that is the direction we will continue to go in. We have always had squabbles among ourselves at WIRSPA, but we kept those squabbles to ourselves. We dealt with them effectively and efficiently because we always bore in mind what the bigger picture was. And that is going to continue in the future. I'm sure we'll have more cases, but we're going to have to find a way to achieve. And I would like to just say this. Some recent stats have shown that the number of jobs and foreign exchange the industry is earning for the region has increased dramatically in the last 20 years or so. I hope those statistics are right, because we took a lot of trouble when we were working on this project to try and collect the information that we needed about number of people employed, foreign exchange earned, etc. And the numbers I am hearing now about what's happening today are substantially higher than what I think my own personal expectations would have been. So I must tell you that EU project was a shot in the arm, and our producers put their money where their mouth was and participated in the programs, and they learned, I hope, along the way, the importance of good governance and proper accounting for all the funds that may be their own and also funds that may be provided to them. That, I believe, was a very big lesson that came out of that whole rum project. And so in the end, we need to develop this and continue this trend, because it is critical that we maintain the public confidence. And I mean by public at all levels, the regulators, the political ends, the people that have supported us and worked for us to help us get our projects underway, who have worked with us to open markets that we were never able to sell freely in before. And I think this is critical, and it's a good challenge for Vaughn and his team as they go forward. The world is changing. Drinking preferences and likes are changing. I watched recently a discuss webinar or whatever it was that indicated the changes that are taking place in your part of the world. And so we can't sit back on our laurels. We have to keep going forward. We have a lot we can do. And at the end of the day, even though the sugar industries in the region are having difficulty at this moment, as you say, you don't have to make sugar and use the molasses, which is what's left over really. You can use the juice as they've done already, and you can use the syrups. And in any way, the rules of origin allow for the importation of the molasses or the syrups, providing always they are from the sugarcane. And if we do that and we do it in the right way, then at the end of the day, what we make here will, yes, our costs may increase because of freight or whatever, but once we are developing the higher end of the market where we can get the added value on branded products, then there's a good chance that this 400-odd-year-old industry, which is one of the bedrocks of our history and our commerce, will continue. I think
I would say we are now out of time. I wanted to thank you very much. I very much enjoyed this conversation. I've been very, very fortunate to have many more conversations with you and learn so much more about this period of history, the late 20th century, early 21st century, that I did not know as much about as I wanted to. So I continue to look forward to our future conversations. And again, thank you for doing this. Any very final words before Federico takes us out?
No, I just think that we've got to stick together. We've got to solve our problems and keep focusing on what is our big objective, because there's a lot more rum we can sell if we put our minds to it. Okay?
All right. Thank you. Federico, take us out.